There are mornings when the mirror answers with a stranger's face, and evenings when an old friend points out a trait you swore you had buried. Identity, our sense of who we are, feels at once like a fortress and like smoke through cupped hands. It shelters, promises continuity, but it also slips and reshapes itself whenever the world presses against it. Imagine standing at the shore while the tide keeps rewriting the sand beneath your feet. Sometimes the footprints you made an hour ago are there, sometimes not. Who then are we when everything changes? We often say identity as if it were a single, sealed thing, a name, a job title, a set of preferences. But what we feel is not a label placed on us from outside and left untouched. It is a living conversation between memory and context, between inner narrative and the social surface that reflects us back. The self is not a static fact. It is an ongoing story we tell ourselves in real time, stitched from habits, choices, betrayals, and loves. When that story is interrupted by loss, by triumph, by migration, by the slow erosion of time, there is a sense of falling into the spaces between sentences. That fall is the birthplace of both terror and possibility. There is loneliness in this fissure. If identity is partly a social mirror, if we are recognized into existence by others, then losing the reflection or seeing it altered can feel like being removed from the world's registry. Have you ever felt that the people who knew you yesterday no longer recognize the person you have become today? It is as though the grammar of your belonging has shifted and you are waiting for a translator who never comes. Loneliness here is not merely being alone. It is the rupture where the self stops aligning with the language around it. It is an ache for correspondence, for someone to know enough to name you accurately, and to keep naming you even as that name changes. And yet, the very breach that creates loneliness also opens a space for creativity. Reinvention is not only an act of loss, it is an act of invention. When the old categories dissolve, we gain the raw materials for new ones. People who rebuild their identities, after divorce, after illness, after political exile, often speak of a strange freedom, the terrifying lightness of having to decide again who to be. That freedom is accompanied by labor. Reinvention is not merely a romantic leap. It requires curiosity, discipline, and a particular kind of honesty. It asks, which parts of my story do I want to keep? Which have been inert, adopted from others? Which are mine when the applause fades? Philosophically, one can read this tension as the perennial conflict between the individual and the community. The individual seeks authenticity, an inner coherence, a felt truth, while the community offers norms, roles, rituals, and the safety of being known. We are braided beings. We are neither islands nor indistinguishable strands. The community gives us a grammar. The individual writes sentences within and sometimes against it. This dance produces both warmth and friction. The communal embrace can heal but also congeal. It can teach us the vocabulary of our virtues and vices, and sometimes it hands us a script we never auditioned for. Choosing subtly, slowly, or in a single decisive moment to deviate from that script can provoke conflict. Conflict that is sometimes necessary because identities that ossify within community expectations calcify the soul. So what practical work happens inside this philosophical knot? The psychological scaffolding that supports healthy identity formation has a few sturdy beams. First, narrative integration. We make meaning by arranging memories into a coherent plot. Trauma or disruption often splinters this plot into fragments. A therapeutic practice, storytelling, journaling, or guided reflection helps us weave fragments back together, not to deny painful ruptures, but to place them within a story that neither minimizes nor obsessively amplifies them. When you can say, aloud or in thought, this is what happened and this is how I responded, you move from being a passive object of events to an author of meaning. That shift is not magic. It is a skill. It requires patience and the willingness to sit with discomfort without immediate while smoothing it over. Second, multiplicity and plural selves. We are not one seamless identity. We are a chorus, roles, inclinations, temperaments, some concordant, some cavalierly at odds. Recognizing that you can be, for instance, a tender friend and a ruthless negotiator in different contexts, or a loving parent and an ambitious artist, dissolves the tyranny of a single true self. Psychological health often looks less like rigid unity and more like graceful cohabitation, learning to host each part with respect and without letting any single voice bully the others into permanent exile. Third, community as practice, not property. Relationships should be grounds for growth, not prisons of expectation. Community rituals, small acts of shared recognition, shared stories, repeated presence, serve as identity scaffolds. But when the community treats identity as property, you are X and you must remain X, it becomes suffocating. The work then is to cultivate communities that value evolution, friends and institutions that can witness change and offer continuity without foreclosure. This might mean building new circles while caring for old ones, or it might mean renegotiating boundaries with people who want a static version of you. Fourth, intentional rituals and rites of passage. Humans have used ritual to mark transitions long before modern therapists wrote about stages. Intentionally framed rituals, however modest. A private walk, a letter burned, a small ceremony, signal to the brain and the social world that a change is happening and matters. These small acts can anchor an identity shift and reduce the disorienting sense that you are moving without a map. But there is also the deeper, raw question. When the social ground shifts beneath us, how do we hold ourselves ethically? Reinvention can be liberating, but it can also become evasive, changing to escape responsibility, to avoid consequences, to dodge grief. Here, moral courage matters. Reinvention done well is not an abdication of accountability. It is the courageous reorientation of one's aims and actions with eyes open to past harms and future possibilities. It asks the hard questions. What of my past should I be accountable for? What is unforgivable, if anything, and what must be repaired? Identity is not a license to restart with a clean slate unless you have first tended to the ledger you left behind. Loneliness surfaces again because ethical remaking requires witnesses. We need people who can attest that a person we once knew differently has changed because they observe the change in practice. That is why social reintegration, showing up repeatedly and differently, is crucial. It is one thing to declare, "I have changed." It is another to live the change until others have empirical cause to trust the claim. Trust accrues by pattern, not proclamation. What, then, are the psychological tools you can practice tonight? Begin with small experiments. Try on a new narrative voice. Write a paragraph about your life as if you were a compassionate stranger observing it. Test one small habit that aligns with who you want to become. Notice the stories you tell yourself in the first minutes after you wake. Are they defensive, accusatory, hopeful? Put a marker on one small belief that no longer serves you and examine its origin. When did you adopt it, and why? Practice curiosity toward yourself by asking, in a voice that is neither harsh nor permissive, where did this part of me come from, and does it still help? Philosophically, there is a practice of radical humility that helps. Accept that identity is fragile because the world is fluid. Fragility is not failure. If you can hold that fragility as the condition of possibility, it changes the tone of your life from anxious preservation, "I must guard my essence," to attentive authorship, "I can shape my next chapter." This is not the same as stoic indifference to loss. It is an acceptance that change is inevitable and that resistance to it, when absolute, becomes its own suffering. And then there is the question I cannot lazy over. What about belonging when the only communities available are hostile to your emergent self? Not all reinvention can be supported by existing circles. Some transformations are too radical for the communities that raised us. In those moments, the solution is twofold. Find or cultivate new communities, physical or virtual, that reflect and challenge your growth, and practice solitude as a constructive ally rather than a verdict. Solitude, when chosen and tended, becomes a laboratory for identity, a place to rehearse new habits, to study your responses without the pressure of constant audience, to learn yourself in fuller tones. We are also built to narrate through art and work, through songs, crafts, and projects, and these external creations can become durable witnesses to changed selves. A poem you wrote during a season of transformation does not forget you the way other people might. Art and projects are external anchors that testify to continuity across change. Finally, remember that identity is not wholly private nor wholly public. It lives in the porous membrane between. Reinvention is a social act as much as a personal one. People remake themselves in conversation with others, with institutions, with histories. To be who you are becoming requires both inward courage and outward patience. The courage to try on new selves, and the patience to let others catch up. So here, at the end of this first part of our journey, I leave you with 3 questions to hold like stones in your pocket as you move through your day. Which parts of my story do I carry because they are mine? And which have I inherited without reading? Where am I practicing creative reinvention? And where am I avoiding necessary repair? Who can I trust as witness for the person I am trying to become? If identity is fragile, it is also reparable. If it slips like sand, we can learn to build with it. Gentle hands, careful designs, rituals that matter. The task is not to fix the self forever, but to become skillful at becoming, at moving through change with integrity, curiosity, and compassion. There is a curious hour, late enough that the house is quieter, but early enough that the mind is not yet exhausted, when identity shows its seams. In that hour, the questions press harder. Who am I when the roles dissolve? When the theater lights go down and the applause stops? It is then you notice the habits that had been standing in for you, the way you speak to order, the particular tilt of your face when you listen, the rituals of coffee, and the tiny rehearsed jokes. These are not trivialities. They are the small scaffolds that prop up a daily existence. Take them away or have them taken away, and you come face to face with a startling absence. The distinction between the self you perform and the self you feel. Performance is not merely deception. It is often a survival skill. From early childhood, we learn what the world rewards. Acquiescence in certain rooms, defiance in others, politeness in some families, and bluntness in careers. The choreography of who we are becomes a set of learned responses, and over time those responses come to feel like character rather than costume. It is a hard thing, then, to disentangle the performed from the permanent. And yet, the disentangling is precisely where growth lives. It asks that we become ethnographers of our own lives, careful observers who note recurring patterns without immediate judgment. What do you do when you are afraid? When you are loved? When you are bored? The answers reveal the contours of identity not as a single silhouette, but as a landscape with ridges and valleys, climates and microclimates. There is also a shadow side to performance, the safe, convincing imitation that keeps us from seeing ourselves honestly. We can get very good at being acceptable, at satisfying the gaze, while our inner temperature quietly shifts. That stealthy drift is why many crises of identity arrive like weather, a slow, imperceptible change until suddenly a storm blows through. Sometimes it is a public rupture, a job loss, a public scandal, an illness, and sometimes it is quieter. A long-time belief that falls away when you meet a new piece of evidence, a friendship that no longer fits, or a taste that surprises you. Such ruptures can leave you feeling betrayed by your own life, as if the map you had been following has been redrawn without your consent. Loneliness in such a moment can be primordial. It is not merely the absence of company, but the estrangement from one's own continuity. There is a grief here, the grief of losing a version of yourself, and grief, unlike other emotions, tolerates no quick fixes. It wants recognition, ritual, narrative. Too often we are taught to perform composure in the face of loss. We smile and proceed. But grief for an identity deserves acknowledgement. An elegy to the person you were, a small ceremony for the roles that have ended. This is not narcissistic wallowing. It is a humane practice that clears space for the next self to emerge. And from that cleared space, creativity almost always arises. Creativity is a twin of loneliness, born from the same lack. But it is the transforming lack. When you stand with a hole in your life, you can either rush to fill it with the old, familiar materials, or you can use it as an aperture for invention. Creative reinvention depends on curiosity. The willingness to ask questions without immediate answers, to play, to fail, to be embarrassed. It requires the courage to be awkward, because awkwardness signals that you are trying something not yet mastered. The world rewards mastery and punishes error. Creativity learns to find the edges of that punishment and to dance there anyway. But what about conflict? When individual reinvention collides with communal expectation, the results can be explosive. Communities are not abstract. They are made of promises, memories, and economic interdependencies. To say, "I am different now," to a family, to a workplace, to a nation, is to ask for renegotiation. Some will love it, some will resist, and some will feel abandoned. The ethical question that threads through such conflict is delicate. How to remain faithful to an emerging truth without abandoning the obligations that tethered you in the first place. There is no universal formula. There are only practices that increase the likelihood of integrity. Clarity in communication, incremental changes to demonstrate reliability, and an openness to repair harm when previous selves caused pain. Repair is a practice that is too often sidelined in contemporary narratives of reinvention. We romanticize the fresh start, the clean break, the reinvention that happens with no accounting. But if identity is woven through relationships, then changing irrevocably without attending to the consequences is a kind of social negligence. Repair does not always mean confession. Sometimes it means demonstrating change through persistent action. Sometimes it means offering restitution. Sometimes it means sitting in the discomfort of someone else's anger without deflecting. It is a labor of humility, acknowledging that your past behaviors had effects on others and choosing to be present for their process of recalibration. Psychologically, one of the most important skills for navigating identity change is metacognition, the ability to observe your own thought patterns and to hold them lightly. When you can notice the stories you are telling yourself, "I am a failure," "I must always be admired," "I am broken," you gain leverage. These narratives were not plucked from the ether. They were learned. They can be revised. Cognitive reframing, a technique used in therapy, is not about fakery. It is about enlarging your interpretive repertoire so that a single loss does not define you utterly. Replace "I failed at this" with "I tried something difficult and learned what doesn't work," and the world tilts. The shift is small but cumulative. Words, over time, rearrange the architecture of belief. Embodiment practices also deserve mention because identity is not only a story we tell but a body we inhabit. Breath, posture, movement, the way we sleep, these are all parts of selfhood. Somatic practices, walking, dancing, yoga, breathwork, are not esoteric add-ons. They are ways to inhabit new configurations of being. When your body learns a new pattern, your self-concept follows. This is why rituals, private or communal, have been central to rites of passage across cultures. They align narrative with physiology. You cannot dramatically claim a new identity in words alone without also letting your body learn the gestures of that identity. Language, too, is formative. The words we use to describe ourselves and others structure perception. Feminist philosophers, narrative therapists, and ordinary people know this intuitively. Language shapes possibility. Saying, "I used to be jealous," invites a different future than "I am a jealous person." The first invites an arc. The second fixes you in a frame. Thus, cultivating language that allows for change, verbs that dramatize movement, qualifiers that allow for nuance is practical work. It is not mere semantics. It is the slow practice of freeing yourself from definitions that feel like cages. There is also the political dimension. Identities are entangled with power. Gender, race, class, and nationality are not only personal stories. They are social positions structured by history and institutions. To reinvent in these domains can be more complicated because the market and the state have stakes in who counts as what. The freedom to become is not evenly distributed. Some people face severe penalties, ostracism, violence, economic exclusion when they diverge from dominant expectations. That asymmetry is a moral reality we cannot ignore. It calls for collective action. Building safer communities, advocating for policy, creating spaces where vulnerability need not be punished. It also calls for solidarity, recognizing that your ability to experiment with identity may rest on the shoulders of others who cannot safely do the same. How, then, to live ethically and creatively within this asymmetry? One practical stance is committed solidarity. As you gain freedom to explore, invest in making that possibility available to others. Teach what you learn. Open doors you find ajar. Use your resources to protect those who must remain hidden. Reinvention that is merely self-serving risks replicating the very structures that constrained you. And what of the observer within you who demands certainty? The mind hates liminality, the in-between, because it prefers tidy categories. Yet most meaningful journeys pass through liminal space. Learn to sit in not knowing with a particular quality of attention. Not panicked speculation, but exploratory curiosity. Ask, what feels true in my bones? What patterns persist regardless of external labels? Which shifts produce relief and which produce more anxiety? Track them. Keep a ledger of experiments and outcomes. This empirical approach to inner life, testing small changes, observing effects, iterating, turns the amorphous work of identity into a series of manageable practices. There are also community practices that smooth transition. Intentional circles, friends, mentors, therapists who can witness changes without coercion are invaluable. Think of these witnesses as living archives. They hold memory when you cannot, and they validate change when you are not yet persuasive to others. Choose such witnesses carefully. Trust is scarce and earned, but invest in at least one person or group who will sit with the uncomfortable parts of you and refuse to reduce you to a past headline. Finally, ask the difficult question about endurance. When you reinvent, will you be the same person 10 years from now? The honest answer is probably not. The self that emerges from today's work will, in turn, be reshaped by new circumstances. This is not failure, but the human condition. A life well lived is a sequence of selves, contiguous but not identical. Each requires stewardship. The practice is not mastery but tending, attending to continuity and rupture with equal care, salvaging what is wise, discarding what is worn, and always choosing the next shape with both courage and compassion. So tonight, when the house quiets and the seams of identity show, try this. Breathe into the discomfort. Name one small thing you can change tomorrow that would test a possibility you have been afraid to try. Write it down as if you are reporting from the future. Tomorrow I will. Then imagine the smallest feasible step toward that. Then imagine the person you will be if that step is taken again and again. Hold that imagined self gently, like someone cradling a lantern in a dark room. You do not need to become that person overnight. You need only show up once, again, and then again. There is a particular kind of quiet that arrives when you confront the ledger of your life, the long, patient accounting that memory demands. Memory is not a faithful archivist. It is a storyteller with a temperament. It abridges, it amplifies, it erases. It stitches together scenes in a way that makes sense of the mess. And because it is trying to make sense, it sometimes cheats. The consequence is that the self you remember is not the same as the self you were. It is the self you have come to accept, justify, or lament. This slippage matters because identity rests on memory like a house rests on its foundations. If the foundation shifts, you feel it in the floors. Sudden aches of regret, inexplicable loyalties, stubborn revulsions that do not seem to belong to you. Think of memory as clay that is continually being reshaped by each retelling. Every time you recount an event, out loud, in a journal, even in the secret theater of your mind, you press a new thumbprint into that clay. The act of remembering is therefore also an act of editing. You choose what stays in focus, what blurs, what gains color. This is not necessarily sinister. It is adaptive. We compress painful details to function. We reframe humiliations to protect ourselves. But when the compression becomes amnesia for moral accountability, or when reframing becomes an instrument of narcissism, we have crossed into a territory that harms ourselves and others. There is a tenderness required when you pick through your memories, a balance of curiosity and restraint. Curiosity because you want the truth of what happened, and restraint because not every memory needs excavation at once. The practice that helps is intentional witnessing. Find a way through writing, therapy, conversation, or ritual to allow each memory its context. Say what happened without immediate interpretation: who, what, where, when. Then, in a second pass, offer your feelings and interpretations. The separation of fact from meaning gives you leverage. Facts are anchors, meanings are voluntary. By distinguishing them, you gain freedom. Freedom to revise meanings that no longer serve you while acknowledging facts that may require repair. Trauma complicates all of this. When an experience is too big for the mind to integrate memory fragments, you may have pockets of your life that are foggy, vivid flashbacks that arrive without context, or emotions that feel displaced. Trauma's logic is survival, and survival sometimes sacrifices narrative coherence. Reintegrating traumatic memory is slow and careful work. It needs safety, psychological and physical, before it can be cataloged. A useful practice here is titration, approaching a memory in small, controlled doses so the nervous system can tolerate it. Think of it as dipping your toe into a cold sea rather than leaping in. Over time, with supportive witnesses and therapeutic techniques, the sea becomes less terrifying and memory can be woven back into story. Memory is not only individual, it is social. Families, cultures, and nations hold collective memories that scaffold our sense of belonging. These collective memories can uplift and sustain, but they can also occlude and exclude. The stories communities tell about who is honorable, who is shameful, who belongs, shape identities across generations. That is why conversations about history are never merely academic. They are arguments over living identity. When collective memory is selective or dishonest, when injustices are minimized or erased, the identities built on those memories are inherently brittle. They are prone to rupture when truth threatens to dislodge comfortable narratives. What does moral repair look like when memory reveals harm? The philosophical heart of repair is acknowledgement. Names matter. Saying, "I did this" or "this happened to us" is not merely confession. It is the first concrete step toward reweaving trust. Repair often requires more than words. Visible, repeated actions that align with the new story you claim. How do you demonstrate that you have changed? Not by announcing it, but by accruing evidence through consistent behavior. If you harm someone, repair is not a transaction. It is a labor of acceptance that the other's pain is not yours to speed through. It demands patience and an orientation toward restitution, whether symbolic or material, where feasible and appropriate. Forgiveness is a trap and a gift, depending on how it is framed. Too often people speak of forgiveness as a moral decree you grant to absolve another and thereby close a wound. But authentic forgiveness, if it is to be meaningful, is a practice that follows accountability and evidence of change. It is also sometimes a choice you make for your own sake, to release the corrosive loop of bitterness that eats your present. Forgiveness need not mean reconciliation. You can forgive internally while maintaining necessary boundaries to protect yourself. The ethical nuance is critical. Forgiveness without accountability can enable further harm. Forgiveness that emerges after real repair can liberate both parties. Memory also offers a surprising resource: the ability to curtail self-fulfilling prophecies. The stories you habitually tell about yourself condition your behavior in ways that often confirm the story. If you tell yourself, "I am someone who always fails," you will approach challenges defensively, giving failure more room to happen. Narrative work changes the script. Begin by keeping a dossier of disconfirming evidence moments that contradict your limiting self-story. Keep it visible. When the old script starts to replay, read the dossier aloud. This is practical cognitive reshaping. Create a counter-memory archive that attests to nuance, resilience, and capacity. Rituals anchor memory in somatic truth. A written apology placed in a box and burned or mailed. A small ceremony at the place where a relationship changed. A public testimony to a community. These acts do more than express feeling. They signal that the story has turned a page. The body and the social world need those signals to accept new chapters. Without ritual, change risks being only private and therefore easily dismissed by both the self and others. There is a philosophical danger when we valorize memory as identity's only keeper. Some thinkers have argued for the primacy of narrative continuity. Your identity is the story you can tell about yourself. Others emphasize psychological continuity, memories, desires, and intentions that persist. Both frameworks can be useful, but neither is exhaustive. Identity is also constituted by choice, action, and responsibility. Memory without moral action can calcify into self-justification. To be a person in the fullest sense, memory must be married to practice. Remembering, acknowledging, repairing, and then acting differently. What are concrete practices you can begin tonight? First, curate a memory audit. For 1 week, keep brief notes of memories that surface, not just big events, but small recollections that return, positive and negative. At the end of the week, sit with a single memory and narrate it in 3 modes: a factual recounting your felt experience and the meaning you have given it. Notice differences. Second, create a dossier of disconfirmation. 3 to 5 incidents that contradict a limiting self-narrative. Review it twice a day for a month. Third, design a small ritual of acknowledgement for any relationship you know you have harmed. A letter you write whether you send it or not. A concrete action you will take to show change. A public or private ceremony that marks your commitment to repair. Fourth, practice titration. If a traumatic memory is too large, break it into smaller pieces and work with a trusted witness or therapist to approach it gradually. Ask yourself, in the quiet, which memories am I protecting because they grant me a particular identity? Which am I avoiding because they demand repair? What story do I tell myself about who I were, who I am, and who I might become? Memory is neither enemy nor ally until you choose how to engage it. It can imprison you in a past self, or it can furnish the raw material for a wiser becoming. Memory's final gift is this: it allows for narrative authorship. You cannot change the past, but you can change the way it informs your present and shapes your future. That change is neither easy nor guaranteed. It requires courage to look honestly, humility to admit harm, patience to repair, and imagination to craft new meanings. When you attend to memory with both tenderness and rigor, you do the slow work of making an identity that is less fragile and more responsive. A self anchored not to petrified facts but to practiced loyalties, to decency enacted over time, and to a story that can hold contradiction without collapsing into despair. There is a particular courage in saying aloud what has been kept quiet. Testimony is an act that trembles between confession and creation. The moment you tell your truth to another, you risk being misunderstood, judged, even abandoned, and you also open the possibility of being recognized, held, and remade. To speak the truth of yourself is therefore a moral technology. It alters the social field as much as it transforms the private landscape. Imagine a room where someone's small, sharp secret is uttered for the first time. The air changes. People adjust. Some recoil, some lean in. What happens next? The responses, silences, reparations, or rejections determines whether identity will ossify into shame or soften into new shape. Testimony is not merely the recitation of events. It is the offering of context, motive, and consequence. It is the difference between saying, "I did this," and saying, "I did this, and here is what I felt, what I did not know, what I have since learned." True testimony includes the ledger, the facts, the harms, and the work you are willing to undertake to make amends. It is therefore a social currency that must be spent with responsibility. When testimony is used as performance without repair, it can be novelistic and self-aggrandizing. But when testimony is coupled with accountability and sustained action, it becomes a bridge between memory and community. Communities respond to testimony in ways that reveal their moral constitution. Some collect testimonies and make them sacred. A town that preserves letters, a family that keeps oral histories by hearthlight, a nation that erects museums of memory. These practices build collective identity through shared remembering. Other communities weaponize silence. They punish those who speak, perpetuate myths that close wounds, and insist that certain stories remain unspoken. The politics of whose testimony is allowed and whose is suppressed is the politics of power. That is why the act of testifying is often political. Marginalized people speak not only for themselves but for those whose voices were smothered. Testimony, in this register, is a refusal to be erased. Art transforms testimony into encounter. A poem, a film, a painting, a play. These are testimonies that do not merely report, they invite. They take private pain and shape it into forms that other people can inhabit without collapsing into paralysis. Art converts singular memory into something that can be held collectively. A painting that hints at a massacre can awaken a city's slumbering conscience. A memoir that lays bare complicity can prompt institutions to investigate. Artists act as translators between inner worlds and public life. and the work of art becomes a witness that outlives the teller. For those who fear being judged in personal conversation, art offers an alternative medium of testimony. Safer in some ways, more public in others, but potent in its capacity to shape communal imagination. Ritual is art's sibling. Ritual provides structure for transitions that language alone cannot anchor. A ritual does not need to be grand to be real. A simple act, lighting a candle in the evening to mark a loss, walking to a river to let a letter go, gathering a small circle and speaking one truth aloud, creates a shared recognition of change. These acts make the inner visible and enlist the social world as participant in your becoming. When communities institutionalize rituals of accountability, public hearings, restorative councils, reparative ceremonies, they create pathways for individuals to be seen as both perpetrators and possibilities. That is the paradox of civic ritual. It exposes harm while also creating space for transformation. Intergenerational narratives are the tapestries on which identities are often embroidered. You carry the stories of your grandparents like songs. You inherit their biases, their traumas, their small loyalties and superstitions. These stories anchor you but can also constrict. Being born into a lineage is an inheritance of both treasure and burden. The living conversation with ancestors, a rereading of family myths, an inquiry into why certain fears recur, a willingness to ask difficult questions about fortune and violence, is necessary work if you intend to make an ethical, creative identity. It is here that testimony takes special shape. Children who ask elders to tell the truth about what was hidden, elders who permit their descendants to know, to judge, and to change the family story. That exchange can fracture families, but it can also free future generations from invisible chains. Conflict emerges when new narratives meet old institutions. A person who resists inherited prejudice, who rejects sanctioned roles, or who claims an identity new and unwelcome will often find social friction. Schools, churches, workplaces, these are engines of continuity, and they can be slow to accommodate change. Navigating this friction requires strategy and courage. It often helps to translate private transformations into public arguments that others can hear. Explain not only what has changed but why, and do so in ways that reach people where they are. This is pedagogy as politics, telling your story so that it becomes a resource for others, not merely an assertion of difference. Solidarity is the soil where difficult identity work grows. When people gather to witness one another without precondition, they create a crucible for change. Intentional allyship looks like more than verbal support. It involves structural adjustments, creating spaces where testimonies are heard, changing institutional policies to protect vulnerable identities, offering material support to those in transition. There is a practical ethics embedded here. If you have the social or economic capital to experiment with identity, use it to widen the field for those who do not. That practical generosity is a form of moral responsibility that bridges the personal and the political. Digital life complicates testimony and identity in new ways. Online, testimony can reach millions and be archived forever. It can provoke swift solidarity or ruthless shaming. Identity experiments performed in public forums can become both liberating and dangerous. The permanence of digital records means reinvention can be haunted by past performance. Managing digital identity, deciding what to reveal, what to redact, what to memorialize becomes a form of curatorial labor. Practice restraint. Share with purpose, anticipate consequences, and remember that some transformations need private soil to take root before being transplanted to the public square. There is also a pedagogy of witness worth cultivating. To listen well is an art. When someone testifies, the listener's role is to hold curiosity rather than judgment, to resist the rush of fixing, and to ask questions that enlarge rather than shrink the teller's world. Ask, what would it mean if this were true? How can I help you make this change real? What would accountability look like here? These are practical phrases that transform passive listening into active partnership. Witnessing does not mean solving. It means testifying in return. I heard you, I saw you, I will remember. And finally, there is the slow work of institutional design. Identity-friendly communities do not happen by accident. They are made when rituals, testimony practices, arts, and policies converge. Schools that teach narrative literacy, workplaces that allow for gradual transitions, legal systems that offer restorative pathways. These are institutions that treat identity as dynamic rather than disposable. Building such institutions requires imagination and political will. It also requires the small, persistent acts of ordinary people. Showing up for difficult conversations, voting for humane policies, mentoring those in transition, and funding arts that tell uncomfortable truths. So what can you do tonight with these ideas? Tell a small truth. Choose one memory you have withheld and offer it to a trusted listener or write it in a sealed letter. Create a modest ritual. Light a candle, set an intention, and name the change you seek. Notice the narratives in your home, what stories are repeated at the table, what legends are never questioned, and ask one gentle question that opens the possibility of rethinking. If you are in a position of relative power, use it to clear a path for someone else's testimony. Make time, offer space, redistribute chance. Holding testimony is to live with a double edge, vulnerability and possibility. When you risk being known, you also invite transformation that no solitary act of will could achieve. The self that emerges from testimony is neither wholly private nor wholly public. It becomes a shared artifact, a living document revised in conversation and practice. This is the ethical, creative work of identity. To speak, to listen, to repair, and to build institutions that remember for us the things we cannot yet carry. Belonging is the quiet gravity that shapes much of who we think we are. It arrives like weather, sometimes a warm sun that bathes, sometimes a fog that muffles. To belong is to be recognized by others in a way that affirms your place. Not merely tolerated, but known enough that the small gestures of daily life make sense. Children know this instinctively. They run toward faces that answer them. As adults, we learn to negotiate belonging through habits, codes, and compromises. The paradox is that belonging both sustains identity and can erode it. To be held by a group is to gain a scaffold for meaning. To be held too tight is to have the scaffold determine your shape. The fragile edge of identity is located precisely where belonging's comfort becomes a demand for conformity. Consider the ordinary places where belonging is enacted. Kitchens, workplaces, religious gatherings, sports teams, online forums. Each of these sites offers a grammar of recognition, rituals, jokes, shared grievances, rhythms of mutual aid. They give you a lens through which to see yourself, and because vision is reciprocal, those lenses also teach others how to see you. Belonging is therefore an intersubjective craft. It requires attention, noticing the cues that indicate safety, learning the language of the group, and also revealing enough of your own interior so that recognition can occur. But the craft goes both ways. Communities that are healthy practice inclusion not as charity but as design. They make room for newcomers, adjust rituals when they exclude, and allow identities to expand rather than contract. Loneliness sits in the fissure when belonging breaks down. It is not always the absence of people. It is the absence of correspondence. You can be surrounded by colleagues and still feel unseen. This particular pain is sharpened in modern life by mobility and by the digital architectures that simulate connection. Social media can give the illusion of belonging, likes, comments, follows, without the quality of sustained witness. Loneliness, in its deepest form, calls for something slower: presence, repetition, and the willingness of others to bear witness to your small, often boring, ongoing self. It is a demand that someone remember you tomorrow as they did today. That mundane continuity is one of the most radical and necessary human gifts. Communities sometimes fail because they fossilize. Traditions calcify into rules that no longer serve their original purpose. Ideals become club membership. This is where creativity and conflict collide. Those who redefine belonging must often challenge long-standing practices. The person who insists on a new language for inclusion, or who refuses to perform a role they were assigned, can be both an artist of community and a lightning rod for resistance. The moral task is to discern when critique is constructive and when it is corrosive. Constructive critique has a pedagogy. It combines an account of harm with concrete alternatives, seeks allies rather than mere opponents, and proposes new rituals to anchor change. Corrosive critique, by contrast, aims to demolish without offering reconstruction. If you want a community that can hold difference, teach it to practice critique that builds. There is a craft to generating belonging where it is absent. It begins with small, repeatable acts of recognition. Remembering names, asking after someone's small calamities and joys, showing up on predictable occasions, passing on a story that gives a newcomer a foothold in the group's memory. Rituals matter here, not for spectacle but for continuity. A weekly dinner, a morning check-in, a book club, a shared playlist. These are modest anchors that, over time, accumulate trust. Trust is the currency of belonging. It is minted slowly, spent often. Those small acts become evidence. You have shown up before, you will show up again. Belonging is thus built by compound interest, tiny commitments repeated until patterns form. Yet belonging is not an unalloyed good. It can protect and it can police. Some communities demand sacrifice as a price of admission, of time, of privacy, of moral compromise. The ethical work of belonging is to recognize when the cost is exploitative and to negotiate boundaries. Boundaries are not betrayals of belonging. They are its preservers. When you refuse to be consumed by an identity demanded by others, when you refuse the totalizing "you must be this to belong," you create space for plural membership. You can belong to several communities in different ways, and that multiplicity is a healthy response to modern complexity. It reduces the danger of over-identification with any single group and allows for richer, more resilient identity constructions. Resilience in identity is partly a social achievement and partly an individual practice. Socially, resilience is supported by communities that have scaffolds for reintegration after failure, a culture that allows people to make amends, a workplace that tolerates honest mistakes when followed by repair, a family that can hold anger without expulsion. Individually, resilience grows from practices that orient you to continuity beyond immediate verdicts. Steady rituals, friendships that outlast seasons, and an internal narrative that includes recovery as a plausible arc. This narrative is not denial of pain. It is recognition that suffering can be legible and useful if processed intentionally. Creative flourish often blooms where belonging is precarious. Outsiders, those at the margins of community life, frequently produce art, ideas, and social forms that rewrite the center. Loneliness and limited belonging can focus attention, encourage novel assemblages, and generate new vocabularies for identity. Yet this same marginality exacts costs: economic precarity, emotional exposure, and sometimes violence. The ethical imperative for those who have found belonging is to create conduits, to bring marginal voices into platforms without diluting their difference, to fund venues where experimentation can happen, to hold space for the awkwardness of genuine inclusion. Politics is always the air we breathe in collective belonging. Laws, norms, and institutions determine which identities are sanctioned and which are punished. Policy shapes possibility. Whether a trans person can change their legal documents, whether a minority language is taught in schools, whether refugees are welcome. If identity is fragile, then the political project is to reduce fragility where possible by designing systems that acknowledge change, protect vulnerability, and allow for the messy work of becoming. This means structural interventions, legal protections, inclusive educational curricula, social safety nets that translate ethical commitments into material security. Without such scaffolding, belonging is brittle and distributed unequally. There are intimate practices that nurture belonging from the bottom up. Learn the discipline of apology and repair. It signals that you prefer relationship to ego. Practice small, deliberate generosity. Share your time, your story, your skills. Foster traditions that matter but are adaptable. Create language in your circles that allows for doubt and revision. Phrases like, "I am trying," or "I was wrong," create breathing room where absolutist language suffocates. Teach children to see identity as iterative rather than fixed. Model curiosity, confess errors, and celebrate reparative acts. By cultivating cultures of modest humility, you inoculate communities against rigid identity policing. Finally, ask yourself some questions that are not speculative but operative. Where do I feel most at home, and what does that place give me that others do not? Which of my attachments are nourishing, and which are claiming me? Who in my life has offered consistent witness, and how can I be that kind of witness for someone else? Which rituals have become rote and deserve reimagining, and which new rituals might anchor the next stage of your life? These questions are practical tools. They orient action. Belonging, properly understood, is not a destination but a practice. It is a skill learned by showing up, by bearing witness, by making space for others, and by tending the small rituals that say, "You are here, you are seen, you matter." When belonging is cultivated with imagination and care, identity loses some of its terror. Fragility remains, because change will always come, but fragility becomes manageable and generative. The work is never complete. It is ongoing tending, a communal sculpture that shifts with weather and time. If you are ready, we will next move into the private arts of endurance, how to weather exile, failure, and grief without losing the capacity to become, and into practical ceremonies that mark and make the self. There are seasons of the soul that do not announce themselves with fireworks. They arrive like the slow dimming of a lamp. Exile, failure, grief. Each of these experiences narrows your world in different ways, and if you let them, they can either harden you into brittle identity or temper you into a more flexible person. Endurance is not stoic immobility. It is a skillful responsiveness. It is a steadiness that can hold pain without becoming identical to it. To learn that steadiness, we must first practice naming what we are facing honestly, saying, "This is exile," or "This is failure," or "This is grief," because naming is the first ethical and psychological act of control we possess. When you give a thing its name, you begin to measure it, and measured pain is more manageable than vague dread. Exile is more than being physically displaced. It is the experience of living in a world that no longer recognizes the version of you that existed before. There are exiles of migration and there are exiles of ideology. Sometimes the walls are geographic, sometimes they are social. The dislocation pries open the question, who am I without the familiar architecture that once affirmed me? In exile, your identity can fragment. The customs, language, and unspoken expectations that once scaffolded you are stripped away. Yet exile also offers a rare vantage point. It teaches the art of translation, how to carry intimacies across borders, how to learn new grammars, how to become fluent in dissonance. The moral task in exile is to avoid the closure of bitterness, to let the lost teach rather than harden, to build new forms of belonging without erasing the old, to witness both the beauty and the wound of transformation. Failure is an intimate teacher. The culture around us often performs success as a moral badge, and failure as a stain to be hidden. But failure, when attended honestly, is a crucible for identity. It strips away illusions of omnipotence and forces a reckoning with limits. This reckoning is painful precisely because it compels you to confront parts of yourself you preferred not to see. Hubris, negligence, naive assumptions. The psychological skill here is radical curiosity coupled with a refusal to catastrophize. Ask, what did I misjudge? Which pieces were external and which were internal? Where did competence meet circumstance? Mapping failure as a set of learnable variables converts shame into information. That does not make the fall feel good. It simply makes recovery plausible. Grief is its own geography. It is not linearly proportional to the loss. It is a crooked measure that visits in waves and surprises. Grief dissolves identity because much of what we are is held in relation to others. Habits formed around their presence, stories that include their voice. When they are gone, the scaffolding collapses and you are left to rebuild. The ethical demand of grief is patience. There is no timetable that will not fail you. The psychological practices that help are small and luminous. Naming the loss aloud, making a ritual of remembrance that requires both heart and body, weaving the deceased back into daily life through memory practices that do not fetishize them but keep them present in a way that is life-giving. Grief asks you to hold contradiction, to mourn and to find moments of joy, to honor absence while participating in the present. Across exile, failure, and grief, there are shared practices that transform fragility into endurance. The first is the discipline of micro-repairs. When the world breaks, one cannot always enact grand fixes. What is available instead are small acts that accumulate evidence of stability. A micro repair might be making a bed every morning to show yourself you can keep a promise, or returning a call you have been avoiding, or tending a plant that will die unless you remember it. These acts are not trivial because they rebuild the trust that you can be relied upon, first by yourself, then by others. Another practice is the cultivation of sanctuary. Sanctuary is not necessarily a cathedral or a designated corner of a room. It is any small arrangement you make that signals to your nervous system that safety is possible. A ritual morning cup of tea taken in a particular chair, a playlist that returns you to steadiness, a friend who answers at certain hours. These are architectures of comfort. Sanctuary is not escapism when it is used to restore capacity rather than to avoid engagement. It is the place you repair before you re-enter the field. Learn to design sanctuaries that are portable. Exile teaches that the ability to recreate safety in different places is a superpower of resilience. Community is indispensable for endurance, but it must be chosen and authored. Some communities are shelters, others are traps. Choose witnesses who can hold contradictions, who will tell you the truth when you need it and also carry your burdens without vanishing. Practice reciprocity. Endurance is not only about receiving help, but about eventually offering it in ways you can. This reciprocity rebuilds moral identity because it turns you from a perpetual consumer of care into a participant in communal life. There is dignity in both receiving and giving. Do not allow shame to monopolize the narrative of dependence. The body is an ally in endurance. Trauma, sorrow, and stress live not only in narrative but in muscles, in sleep architecture, in breath. Somatic practices, walking with attention, simple breath exercises, gentle movement, retrain a body that has learned anxiety as its default setting. When the nervous system is soothed, cognitive flexibility returns. Even 15 minutes of intentional movement can alter the chemistry of despair. Practical disciplines, regular sleep, modest exercise, food that nourishes rather than anesthetizes, are not vanity. They are moral acts that preserve the soil in which identity can regrow. Meaning-making is the higher-order work of endurance. Suffering inescapably asks why. The answers matter not because there is always an ultimate cosmic explanation, but because the meaning you choose determines how you act in response. Does failure become a final verdict or a chapter? Does grief become an identity you wear as exile or a lineage you carry into the future? The philosophical practice here is to cultivate generative meanings, narratives that do not flatten pain into pseudo-heroic cliches, but also refuse to let suffering define totality. Ask, what has this cost and what might it afford? What moral commitments emerge from this wound? Turning suffering into a source of responsibility, toward others, toward craft, toward justice, is not an act of falsified positivity but a way to orient pain toward action that matters. Hope is not naive optimism. It is an orientation. It is a disciplined refusal to let the present's gravity determine the future forever. Hope is practical when paired with agency. It is not simply waiting for things to get better but taking small, repeated steps that increase the likelihood of better outcomes. Hope requires imagination. Envision the smallest plausible version of a different tomorrow and then ask what is the immediate next step. Make a plan that is compassionate in its pace. Break the impossible into doable increments. There are moral and philosophical limits to endurance. Endurance should not be an alibi for injustice. Suffering that is imposed through abuse, exploitation, structural violence does not demand that the individual simply endure. It demands revolt, repair, and collective action. To ask someone to endlessly endure suffering that could be ended through intervention is cruel. The ethical clarity is this: personal endurance is necessary when change is not immediately possible, but it is not sufficient when systems can and should be altered. Resistance and endurance are siblings. One preserves life, the other seeks to improve its conditions. Finally, the long arc of identity across exile, failure, and grief can yield a strange gift, a particular kind of humility. Humility is not self-abasement. It is the recognition that you are not the only story in the room. It softens the arrogance of certainty and enlarges curiosity. That humility enables creativity. You become willing to try modest experiments for the chance of new life. It also fertilizes compassion. When you recognize the contingency of your own identity, you are less quick to harden others for their failures. Tonight, if you are walking through any of these seasons, try this. Choose one micro-repair to do before sleep, something concrete, small, and visible. Write one sentence that names the feeling you carried today. Then, identify one small act of generosity you can do this week for someone else that does not cost you your dignity. These are tiny lodestars, but lodestars become navigational systems when used repeatedly. Reinvention is an act of deliberate making, a kind of domestic craftsmanship applied to the loftiest material, the self. It is not a single heroic stroke, but a slow series of trials, prototypes, and adjustments. Imagine yourself as a workshop. There are tools you already know how to use, some benches crowded with projects, and a table cleared for a new experiment. To reinvent is to sit at that table and begin with small, concrete work. Sand down one rough edge, test a new joint, see how it holds. The most seductive stories about reinvention paint it as instantaneous. A haircut, a move, a resignation letter. But real transformation is usually painstaking, iterative, and often leavened with quiet humiliation. You will try things that feel foolish. You will fail publicly and privately. You will find small, unexpected joys. That is the shape of becoming. Ask yourself, who do I want to become, not as an idealized silhouette, but as a person who can be described with verbs, the things they do repeatedly, the practices they keep. Identity is less a noun than a set of repeated actions. Choose verbs you admire. Shows up, listens, makes, repairs, pays attention, learns. Then design tiny tests that let you practice those verbs in low-stake settings. Reinvention as lab work means creating small, safe experiments that answer practical questions. What happens if you speak up once in the meeting? What if you take a month to write 10 minutes a day? What if you apologize without qualifying it? Each experiment yields data. Collect the data. See patterns. Let proof, not rhetoric, guide the next move. There is an ethics to leaving and an ethics to staying. Leaving can be liberation. It can also be abandonment. Staying can be loyalty. It can also be self-erasure. The hard work is to discern which is which, and that discernment is rarely binary. Before you quit a job, dissolve a partnership, or sever a family tie, ask, what obligations have I accrued here? What harms would my departure inflict, and can they be mitigated? What is being asked of me if I stay? Are those expectations reasonable or suffocating? Practically, make a ledger what you owe and what you need. Be honest with yourself and the people involved. Transparency does not guarantee acceptance, but it lowers the chance that your leaving will be experienced as a betrayal rather than an ethical act. Testing new selves requires a method. Think of each possible self as a prototype rather than a destiny. Create a minimum viable self, the smallest set of behaviors that would meaningfully instantiate that identity. If you want to be a person who writes, commit to 1 paragraph a day for a month. If you want to be someone who is generous, commit to 1 anonymous act of service each week. These commitments should be specific, measurable, and bounded. After your trial period, evaluate honestly. What changed inside you? What changed in the world around you? Did new doors open? Did the experiment cost more than you anticipated? Were you more at peace or more anxious? Use these answers to iterate. Feedback is oxygen. Reinvention in isolation is wishful thinking. It becomes real when reflected in the responses of others. Seek feedback deliberately and from different sources. Mentors who can see patterns, friends who will be candid, strangers whose reactions are less freighted with history. Learn to ask questions that produce useful answers. What difference did you notice in me this month? Is more useful than, do you like my change? Prepare yourself for disconfirmation. It is not failure but information. When feedback is painful, separate critique of behavior from critique of worth. The former helps you improve. The latter is usually a mirror of someone else's anxieties. There is a practical discipline to testing, documentation. Keep a log of experiments, small wins, and setbacks. Write a quarterly report to yourself. Over time, you will have an identity portfolio, a tangible record of who you have tried to be and what evidence supports the claim. This portfolio is both practical and merciful. It prevents you from being hostage to the loudest memory of a single failure, and it gives others a track record to trust. Ceremony matters because change that is private often gets dismissed by the social world. A quiet ritual, a letter sealed and mailed, a dinner where you announce an intention, a small symbolic act like planting a tree, signals to others that a transformation is important enough to be witnessed. These ceremonies do not need to be theatrical. They need to be real. Gestures that you will repeat if necessary, promises you can keep. Ritual aligns your nervous system and the social world. It gives gravity to beginnings and endings. Accountability is the counterweight to reinvention's romance. It is easy to talk of becoming without taking responsibility for past patterns. True reinvention often requires repentance in the original sense. A turning toward. Who have you been careless with? What patterns sustained your old self? Make a list and translate it into action steps. Accountability partners, public commitments, and restitution, where appropriate and feasible, are not punitive. They are integral to moral transformation. They build trust and show that your project of becoming is not merely cosmetic. Play is a secret engine of reinvention. When you allow yourself to improvise, to be clumsy, to make bad versions of things, you reduce the pressure of perfection and create space for novelty. Children reconfigure themselves through play. Adults often forget this method. Schedule time to experiment without consequence. Try a class you would never have taken, learn an instrument badly, cook a dish you will probably ruin. These acts stretch the neural muscles responsible for adaptability and joy. They are as important to identity work as serious reflection. Constraints are paradoxically liberating. When options feel endless, identity becomes vaporous. Boundaries force creativity. Choose constraints that matter. A month without social media, a budget that requires simple pleasures, a promise to respond to no more than 3 emails a day. Constraints make the experiments manageable and teach you what you value when distractions are removed. They also protect you from the tyranny of constant reinvention by creating a measure of focus. The craft of reinvention includes learning to live with partial success. Rarely will you become everything you imagine. The real task is to press toward coherence. Some parts of you will persist. Others will fall away. Accept that the finished product is not a fixed portrait but a continuing project. Celebrate micro-transformation, the fewer impulsive answers, the improved relationships, the steady practice. These are real metrics. They add up. Finally, cultivate a modest philosophy of compassion toward yourself in the laboratory of change. Reinvention is not self-rejection disguised as improvement. It is a tender commitment to become more capable of care, more honest, more useful. Treat your missteps as data, not destiny. Talk to yourself as you would to a friend embarking on a difficult apprenticeship, with encouragement, clear feedback, and the patience to bear repeated failures. Tonight, choose one small experiment, a minimum viable self, and commit to it for 30 days. Write down what success will look like in terms you can observe. Tell one trusted person what you are trying to do and ask them to check in once at the end of the month. Design one tiny ceremony to mark the beginning. A candle, a note to future you, a photograph. Then show up tomorrow and again the next day. Reinvention is built from repetition more than rhetoric. Power moves through the world like an architecture people rarely notice until the ceiling caves in. It is not always violent or dramatic. More often it is quiet, procedural, built into forms, application forms, dress codes, algorithms, job descriptions, school curricula that set the shape of possible lives. To understand identity in a world of power is to see how systems make themselves easy and others costly. The person who wants to become is not only an inward craftsman. They confront scaffolding that either supports or resists the work. This friction is where politics meets psyche, where moral imagination must become practical strategy. Often the first lesson is simple and brutal. Freedom to experiment is unequally distributed. Some have the luxury to try on selves because they possess safety nets, economic, familial, legal, that absorb failure. Others risk everything with a single experiment. That inequality is not incidental. It is manufactured by institutions that reward conformity, penalize deviation, and concentrate resources. If reinvention is an art, it is also a privilege. Recognizing that fact is not a discouraging fatalism but an ethical starting point. If you have margins to spare, what will you do with them? If you do not, how can you find or make margins collectively? Institutions, schools, employers, religious bodies, states, platforms often demand legibility. They want identities that can be filed, coded, processed. Legibility makes management easier. Categories fit into forms and algorithms. But legibility often flattens nuance. It forces complex, evolving persons into boxes that were designed for a different century. The cost is personal. People begin to perform what can be easily measured rather than what is true. The cost is social. Valuable forms of difference get erased because they do not comport with efficient governance. The moral project here is to make institutions more porous, to design systems that tolerate ambiguity and that reward adaptability rather than simple predictability. Resistance has many faces. For some it is radical exit, leaving an organization, a place, a country. For others it is slow redesign, staying within to change practice, to create spaces of experiment, to alter policy step by step. Both strategies are legitimate and both are risky. The careful strategist asks, where will my departure create a vacuum that hurts someone else? Where will my staying create a permanent dissonance that grinds me down? There is no universal answer, only the disciplined work of mapping costs and responsibilities. Political action, petitioning, organizing, voting, litigating translates identity work into collective leverage. If you want your emergent self to be socially legible, pursue the civic channels that transform private possibility into public right. Power also disciplines identity through narratives, stories that become common sense about who is worthy, who is dangerous, who is deserving. These narratives are social technologies. They shape policy and culture together. Changing them is slow work of storytelling, art, and pedagogy. It demands patient cultural labor, schools that teach critical history instead of sanitized myths, media that diversifies storytellers, art that complicates easy tropes. If you seek an identity that current narratives cannot hold, become a teller or an enabler of new tales. Support stories that complicate, that refuse neat moral binaries, that insist on the humanity of the disavowed. Story work is public pedagogy. It is how communities learn to expand their imaginations of who may flourish. Institutions also discipline through incentives, promotions, grants, tenure, insurance policies. These are not neutral. They align with particular behavioral models. To change what identity is rewarded, change incentives. This can be quiet, local work. Create evaluation criteria at your workplace that value collaboration and repair, not merely output. Lobby your school to include narrative competence as a metric. Design professional norms that recognize care work as central rather than marginal. Policymaking is rarely glamorous, but it is where durable change accrues. If your identity project requires institutional recognition, name changes, legal protections, anti-discrimination measures, then seek allies in policy, law, and organized movements. The private courage of reinvention must often be matched by public organizing. Surveillance and commodification complicate everything. In a market where identity can be monetized, profiles, brands, personal data, the pressure to perform a sellable self is intense. Platforms extract attention and then monetize the very traces of becoming. The result is a double bind. You can advertise your reinvention and gain capital, but you also risk freezing a performance that haunts later change. To live ethically in this economy, cultivate practices of curatorial discretion. Decide what parts of yourself you will put on display and for what purpose. Learn to archive strategically. Maintain private journals, ephemeral experiments, and a public persona that is enough to transact with the world without being your entire story. The politics here calls for stricter privacy norms, ownership of personal data, and collective pushback against commodifying architectures that make identity a product. There is power in networks if networks are intentionally built to protect fragile becoming. Mutual aid groups, worker cooperatives, affinity spaces, and community land trusts are institutional forms designed to redistribute risk and expand freedom to experiment. They work because they turn private vulnerability into shared stewardship. If you cannot afford the luxury of solo reinvention, seek collective forms that lower the stakes. Pooled childcare, shared studios, community health funds. Building these networks is slow, practical politics. Neighbors agreeing on principles, activists drafting bylaws, artists pooling resources. It is not glamorous, but it is where durable safety lives. Allyship is a particular moral technology for institutional change. Effective allies do more than speak. They act to dismantle barriers. They use their institutional capital, promotions, budgets, platforms to create breathing room for those experimenting with identity. Allyship is not feeling good about being on the right side. It is taking risk on behalf of others and receiving discomfort when power is challenged. Practically, allyship looks like advocating for inclusive policies, modeling new language, mentoring those who are otherwise excluded, and stepping back from opportunities to make space for marginalized voices. The goal is not benevolence but redistribution. Education is both a long lever and a delicate one. Will your new space become gated by taste and resources? Will it inadvertently replicate exclusionary patterns? The best reformers look for nested impacts. Who benefits? Who loses? Who becomes newly visible? Who remains invisible? Design changes that explicitly include access plans, sliding scales, mentorship pipelines, and feedback loops that invite revision. Political action that protects fragile identity includes both local and structural strategies. Locally, push for policies that make reinvention less costly. Paid leave, universal health care, anti-discrimination laws, educational supports. Structurally, support movements that seek to change the distribution of power, labor organizing, civil rights efforts, privacy legislation. Remember that private transformation is often contingent on public goods. The courage to try on a new self can be a civic gift only if the public scaffolding supports it. Finally, build a practice of radical pragmatism. Combine moral clarity with tactical flexibility. You will face institutions that are stubbornly slow. You will need to choose fights that are winnable and fights that are necessary even if they cost you dearly. Not every battle must be won at once. Prioritize interventions that create durable safety for others as well as yourself. Think in terms of decades, not headlines. As you move forward, hold these practical questions like compasses. Which institutions shape my life most powerfully, and how are they legible to me? Where can I steward change from inside, and where must I build alternatives? Whom do I need to recruit, legal experts, artists, organizers, to make this change durable? What small public policy or workplace norm, if altered, would widen the field for people like me to experiment with identity safely? Power does not only crush, it can be reoriented. Institutions can be redesigned, incentives shifted, stories retold. The task is enormous, but it is not purely abstract. It is carpentry and choreography and lawmaking and art. It asks you to think like a citizen as well as a soul maker, to translate inner courage into collective architecture. There is an art to being alone that many of us never learn because solitude is so often conflated with failure or exile. Yet solitude is not merely absence. It is a terrain, a laboratory where the self can be tested, refined, and sometimes born anew. When the world quiets and your habits drop away, you meet a version of yourself who has no audience. This unobserved self can be terrifying because it has no props, no applause, no scripts. Can also be the most honest companion you will ever know. In solitude, you are forced to answer the question we tend to dodge in durable company. What of me survives when the mirrors are removed? Solitude practiced well tempers both arrogance and dependency. It teaches you how to witness your own interior life with steadiness rather than drama. The first rule is simple and often ignored: choose solitude. There is a difference between being abandoned and choosing to be alone. The former injures, the latter empowers. When you choose, you set an intention and a time frame, and the nervous system recognizes containment. Start small. An hour with no devices, an evening without social feeds, a weekend retreat from the ordinary script. In these bounded intervals, you can learn the rhythms of your attention without being overwhelmed. There are practices that transform solitude from empty space into fertile ground. Make a practice of slow observation. Walk without destination and note 3 things you have never noticed before. A pattern in the pavement, the way light names a building, the cadence of a neighbor's laugh. Slow observation trains the mind to find novelty in the ordinary and dissolves the tyrant of constant evaluation. Add a practice of reflective writing. After each period of chosen solitude, write a page that answers 3 prompts. What arrived? What surprised me? What felt tender or sharp? The discipline of translation, turning felt experience into language, creates a tether between feeling and meaning. Over time, those pages become a map of your inner experiments. Solitude is often where you must do the moral sorting that social life compresses. Without the pressure of reputation, you can examine the quieter motives of your choices, the small compromises you have normalized, the pleasures you defended as harmless that in truth cost others, the loyalties that have calcified into obligations. Do this without a posture of self-condemnation. Think of it as inventory. Name a habit that no longer serves you and design one realistic microshift to test for 30 days. Solitude gives you the space to carry out such experiments without the immediate friction of others' expectations. But solitude can also be a trap when used as avoidance. There is a subtle self-deception where you hide in the pretense of deep work while actually fleeing relationship, responsibility, or repair. The ethical practice is to balance solitude with witness. Choose at least one person, friend, mentor, therapist, who will act as a reality check. Share with them your intention for solitude and agree on a check-in rhythm. Solitude should ideally be both private lab and accountable experiment. The witness's role is not to interrupt discovery, but to prevent isolation from calcifying into self-delusion. Embodiment practices transform solitude into something lived rather than merely thought. Breathwork, slow movement, felt sense scanning, the ancient and modern tools that relink body and narrative are crucial. Try a daily ritual. 20 minutes of walking at a conscious pace, noting posture and breath. 10 minutes of journaling immediately after. Do this for 2 weeks and observe how language becomes steadier and choices less frantic. The body remembers long after the rational mind has given up. By training posture and breath, you anchor identity in somatic truth, not only in clever stories. Threshold ceremonies are the social counterpart to private solitude. Major changes demand marking because the social world needs signals to reorient. Without ceremony, your reinvention risks being invisible or dismissed. A threshold ceremony need not be ornate. It needs to be concrete, witnessed, and repeated if necessary. Write a short script. Name the old self, speak aloud what you are releasing, name the new practice you will try on, and ask a witness to speak a binding phrase or to hold a small object, a ring, a stone, a photograph that symbolizes the agreement. The act of stating your intention in public, even to one trusted person, changes the nervous system and invites the social world to participate in the becoming. Design rites of passage for transitions that matter. A leaving ritual for a job, a naming ceremony for a new identity, a small feast for an ended relationship. These acts do not need permission from tradition. They can be invented. The important features are clarity, what is ending and what is beginning; materiality, something visible to hold and return to; witness, someone who can testify to the change; and repetition, a promise to return to the ritual if the new self wobbles. Over time, these private ceremonies accumulate social legitimacy because the people in your life learn to expect them and to take them seriously. There is a political dimension to solitude too. Not everyone can safely be alone. Some are surveilled, censored, or at material risk when withdrawn. The practice of solitude must therefore be adaptive. If private retreats are dangerous, create micro-rituals in public spaces. An hour at a library corner, a daily walk that passes a particular tree, a public journal you keep but do not post. Resistance to oppressive conditions sometimes requires communal solitude, shared weeks of quiet, communal reading rooms, collective silence that protect individual reflection while preserving safety. Creativity often blossoms in the intersection of solitude and constraint. Give yourself a small, pressurized project. 20 poems in 30 days, one short scene each evening, a portrait series limited to 3 tonalities. Constraints force invention. Solitude gives the mind the uninterrupted runway to take creative off-ramps. Do not expect masterpieces. Expect experiments. Keep them visible somewhere, an archive, a drawer, a private folder. to remind yourself that identity is incremental craft. There is also a practice of naming continuity. Cultivate a portable anchor you carry across changes. This could be a sentence, a short creed you return to each morning. It could be a physical object, a bracelet, a stone, whose tactile presence slows panic. Could be a song or a sequence of breaths. The anchor is not a fixed identity. It is a promise to yourself. Small, achievable, and repeatable. On days when solitude feels like exile, return to the anchor and measure the gap between intention and action. Loneliness and solitude are cousins. The difference lies in agency. If you feel alone without choosing it, the remedy is social. Reach to witnesses, practice asking for small things, share one truthful sentence with a trusted friend. If you choose solitude and it curdles into self-absorption, the remedy is curiosity. Apply your solitude outward for a time. Write a letter to someone you admire, compose a public note of gratitude, create something to give away. Use solitude to sharpen generosity rather than to harden complaint. Practical ceremonies for endings and beginnings I often recommend are deceptively simple and effective. Write 2 letters, one to the old self and one to the new. In the first, list what you will grieve and what you will forgive. In the second, write the first actionable promises you can keep for 30 days. Seal them in envelopes. Date them. Choose a day to open the new self letter. Burn or bury the old self letter in a way that feels sacred to you. Watching the smoke is not symbolic indulgence, but a physical act that aligns nervous system and narrative. Invite a witness if it matters. Repeat annually if the change requires rehearsal. Finally, hold these questions close as practical instruments of reflection. When I am alone and unobserved, what tends to define me? Habit, fear, desire? Which practices of solitude have made me more honest rather than more defensive? What small ritual would make my next transition legible to the people I trust? Who will be my witness and what will I ask of them? Solitude, properly tended, becomes more than a refuge. It becomes a form of citizenship of the self. It teaches you to be a responsible interior neighbor, to attend to the messy apartments of your feelings without squatting in them, to renovate what is broken, to open your door again when the time is right. It makes you capable of being with others in ways that are neither symbiotic nor absent, but deliberate, generous, and enduring. There is a quiet that settles when a long conversation with yourself and the world comes to an end. Not silence as absence, but silence as the comfortable hum after instruments have been tuned. We began by noticing the mirror stranger and by asking who we are when everything changes. We have walked through memory's clay, testimony's risk, belonging's gravity, the sting of exile and the apprenticeship of failure, the deliberate craft of reinvention, the politics that shape possibility, and the inward work of solitude that makes honest becoming possible. In this last stretch, let us not tidy these strands into a theorem, but hold them together like a constellation. Points of light whose relations make something larger than any single star. Identity, we have discovered, is not a monolith but an ecology. It is a tissue of practices, relationships, memories, institutions, and bodily habits, each alive, each partial, each intermittently faithful. To treat identity as fixed is a kind of violence. It robs the future of possibility and the present of attention. To treat it as wholly formless is another violence. It deprives us of continuity, making every small choice feel like abandonment. The ethical posture that reconciles these apparent opposites is a practice I will name not to brand but to direct: temperate authorship. Temperate authorship means you regard your life as a text you are writing in company, with humility about what you can control and responsibility for what you cannot ignore. It asks you to be bold enough to revise and gentle enough to keep the people and obligations you do not own. What does temperate authorship look like in the day-to-day? It looks like naming one story without erasing the others. I am trying on X, and I honor the parts that brought me here. It looks like ceremonies that signal change. Small, repeated acts that the body and the social world can register. It looks like repair practices that are concrete, not slogans but actions, and a willingness to let trust accumulate slowly. It looks like the discipline of experiments that are bounded and measured, and it looks like community making that treats belonging as an ongoing project, not a static entitlement. Philosophically, temperate authorship rests on 2 truths. First, Contingency is not catastrophe. Everything that forms us, language, family, laws, chance encounters, is historically situated. This contingency means identity is fragile, yes, but it also frees us from metaphysical prison. There is no true self, fossilized at birth waiting to be excavated. The self is always a project. Second, responsibility travels with freedom. The more you claim the right to remake yourself, the more you owe to those who have been affected by your previous selves and to those who lack the safety to try. Freedom without attention becomes narcissism. Change without repair reproduces harm. Psychologically, the long-term practices that make identity resilient are deceptively ordinary. Keep a ledger. Not a tyranny of metrics, but a compassionate log of experiments, repairs, witness, and iteration. Maintain a dossier of disconfirmation. Tangible evidence that your past is not destiny. Anchor in small rituals. Predictable acts that tell your nervous system you are a person who can keep promises to yourself. Tend your body with basic care. Somatic steadiness scaffolds cognitive flexibility. Build a portfolio of witnesses, people who will tell you both truth and consolation. And practice the art of slow feedback. Seek counsel, accept correction, and let others' perceptions be data rather than indictments. When institutions press against experiment, act with both strategy and solidarity. Work inside when you can, build alternatives when you must, and redistribute the safety you accumulate. If you are lucky enough to have margins, material, social, legal, lean into allyship. Use those margins to make institutions porous. Push for policies that treat identity as process. For example, protections that recognize transitional needs, educational curricula that teach narrative literacy, workplace norms that allow for repair and reinvention. When change is large-scale, organize. Small acts of policy change compound into cultural possibility. There is also a moral technology to language. Be precise and generous with labels. Use verbs more than nouns. Say, I am learning patience, rather than I am patient. Use terms that invite movement, not entrapment. When you name others, allow for pluralities. People can be tender and fierce, compromised and courageous. Resist the brag of any single identity that wants to be definitive. And grief, that stubborn, knotted teacher, must be given its own economy. Grief wants ritual, repetition, and witness. Let it have those. Make space for elegy and for small joys that do not betray loss but that prove life's capacity to hold both. Forgiveness should be treated with care. Not a quick absolution, but a decision that may follow accountability and evidence. Learn the difference between forgiving for yourself so you can live and forgiving in a way that lets harm continue unexamined. Creativity is not merely consolation. It is a political act and a practice of repair. When we create, we make new public things that witness our private changes. Art, mentorship, and civic contribution are ways of extending your becoming into a world that can remember your effort. Do the small creative acts that matter to you and, where possible, translate them outward. Teach, exhibit, publish, build communal rituals. In that outwardness, your identity becomes durable and generous. Finally, cultivate curiosity as a moral habit. Curiosity is not idle wonder. It is disciplined attention that asks useful questions. What am I defending by resisting this change? Who will suffer if I do this? What would happen if I tried a small, risky thing for 30 days? Curiosity combined with compassion steers reinvention away from solipsism and towards service. I will leave you with a set of images rather than a checklist, because images stay with us in the body when rules fall away. Imagine a garden with many plots. Some are tended and cropped yearly. Others are wild with experiments. You plant with humility, you hoe with persistence, you invite neighbors to share seeds, and you are honest about which areas you cannot care for alone. Imagine a library where each book is a self you have tried on. Some you keep on the shelf, some you donate, some you rewrite. Imagine a small lamp you carry. A ritual lamp lit at the beginning of every month as a promise to test one small truth. These are simple tools, but tools matter. So ask yourself now, softly, what one small experiment will you begin tomorrow that, repeated, would change the shape of your life a year from now? Whom will you tell as witness? What repair do you owe that you could start today with a single, humble act? How will you use whatever margins you have to widen the field for someone else to become? If identity is fragile, this is not a cause for despair, but a call to craftsmanship. To be human is to be in process. To be moral is to make that process as open, responsible, and creative as possible. Carry fragility like a lantern, not as a sign of weakness, but as the gentle light that reveals the steps ahead. The work will be slow, often clumsy, and sometimes lonely. It will also be luminous, communal, and full of surprising friendship. When you go out into the next day, take one small, brave step. The self will follow, not as a single, unchanging stranger in the mirror, but as an author who writes and rewrites, who attends to harm, who finds companions, and who, in the slow work of practice, becomes both more true and more generous.